All right, y'all ready? Like I said at the beginning, we'll start Ecclesiastes and finish Ecclesiastes, and probably a little early today. I hope nobody objects to that idea. So let's turn to Ecclesiastes. And different than Psalms, different than Proverbs, now we're going to focus on the rest of the wisdom books. And these are the books that deal with one central idea. That's, each book has its own central idea. Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and the last book, Job, that we'll cover next week. Each deals with one of those big life questions or issues that are broadly, widespread part of the covenant community, and in some cases even broader than that. Like this question here, what is the meaning of life? Have you ever had anybody ask you that question before? What do you think the meaning of life is? What's your spin on the meaning of life? That's a question that everybody's asking as part of being, as part of being part of the human race. That's the question that we all have hot-wired into us, by the way. We'll talk more about that later. So that's the big question of the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, let's just think about this. It's kind of a comical slide, but all the in-between stuff. Turn to your neighbor, turn to a friend, or someone that you haven't met before, or find somebody in the room to partner up with, and come up with 3 ideas of what people out there through those windows do with the in-between stuff. What are we filling in there as a society, as a culture, worldwide, right?
Activities or meaning?
This is the in-between stuff, between birth and death. What's providing the meaning for life? Yeah, how is the in-between being defined? I mean, so go ahead and take some time with your conversation partner. Groups of 2 or 3 are fine. And you online can have a chat conversation about this. How'd you do that so fast? You're crazy. You just copy and paste?
I did that.
Okay.
I figured out how to. So instead of
without the bold.
No, instead of copying and pasting from your email, I cut the whole email and I put it on a Word document. And I take it off of the Word document.
Oh, okay.
And then it doesn't put like highlights around certain things.
Okay.
They just put some boxes. I'm afraid that someone's like, "Oh, this is the correct answer."
All right.
What do you mean with the question?
Oh, how does the world and how does the culture out there answer the question, what is the meaning of life?
Okay.
That's it, very simply.
So,
Just, yeah.
no ancient mind.
Anything goes. Anything goes. Not the right answer, but what are the answers out there that people come up with for meaning to life? right, so let's pull together. So let's pull our ideas together a little bit. What are some of the things that you came up with? What is culture doing with this question? What is the meaning to life? What have they come up with? What are their answers? Anybody? Just shout them out. Career defines meaning.
Self-fulfillment.
Self-fulfillment, right?
Relationships.
Okay. Relationships. Adventures.
Yeah.
The high adventure. That's really popular these days, yeah?
Finding happiness.
Just pursuit of happiness. Good, right?
Preserving family heritage.
Preserving family heritage. Oh, okay. To life.
Instant gratification.
Instant gratification coming
Sex,
from.
drugs, and rock and roll.
Okay. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Wow. Thank you for that.
Well, so you type that or is that from you? No, he put, I would never say stuff like that.
No, that's all right. That nails it on the head, though. Other ideas over here? Anybody? Yes, sir. Just happiness in general? Yeah. Uh-huh.
Are you doing that like recently?
Okay. Anybody else? These are all good. We have, and if you think about how much of I don't know what the estimation would be, but thinking of like what percentage of our gross national product is spent on the answers to this question? If you think about that, right? It would be unbelievable how much time and money we waste, or culture out there wastes, on trying to get at the bottom or trying to get some satisfaction out of that question. Meaning to life. Either we spend money on it thinking we have the answer, or we spend money on something that's not the answer as a diversion. We try to get away from the answer. When we don't have the answer, we hide from it with our excesses.
I read a fun fact this past week about spring break.
Mm-hmm.
Spring breakers spend $1 billion.
$1 billion.
Spring break.
Just on spring break. It's a week and then it's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or not.
All right.
A fun fact,
But we have, these philosophies of life that are at the foundation, right? Some of these maybe you've studied before. If you've had philosophy, these, they're there. They won't be on your, I don't know. We may ask about the final exam. I don't know. But these are common philosophies of life. And these are global. These are worldwide, linked to the question. So existentialism, meaning to life, is determined by the individual. You define it yourself. You define your own meaning, what your meaning to life is. Hedonism was referred to earlier. Meaning to life is found in the pursuit of pleasure and self-indulgence. Nihilism is life has no meaning, so it's just denied altogether. The denial of anything meaning. Science, I kind of came up with this kind of creative way. Science will eventually overcome death and disease and provide all with the possibility of infinitely long, good, and meaningful lives. Science, think about science. And overall, what it's trying to do is cure all disease, all suffering, remove all pain, all suffering. The purpose of life is to diminish all constraints on our being intellectual, psychological, physical, and moral, and to remake the external world in ways conducive to the emergence of meaning. So that's kind of complicated, but at the heart of it, I think that's what's going on. Some philosophers have tried. Socrates, meaning to life is found in pleasure in the present. Einstein said to create satisfaction for ourselves. Curious, meaning to life is finding and experiencing all the best that life has to offer. Humanism or secular humanism, there's no specific meaning to life. Kind of a little bit of existentialism. Everyone defines it for himself. So these are philosophies that all are asking the question, trying to provide the answer to that basic question, that foundational question. But the author of Ecclesiastes is not really asking that question. What is the meaning of life? He's got something a little deeper that he's going after. So what's different for the author of Ecclesiastes, and I think it's probably Solomon, if life is unjust and God is just, so in other words, if I'm living in this world and there's a God, that's his starting point, right? then what is the moral value of life? So not just the meaning of life, but the moral value. There's a little different way of asking that question. What's the moral value of life? And that's and let's see. And this goes all the way back to Moses. It shouldn't surprise us that Moses is the one that laid out from the very beginning some of these foundational building blocks. The world, for Moses teaches very specifically that the world is intentionally and intelligently and purposefully created. Intelligently, intentionally, and purposefully created. So thus, living within that realm must have value in some way, some defined way. That's really what we're getting at. So human beings, Moses teaches or taught us, are the pinnacle of this creation. Human beings are the ones who are the ones asking this question, right? No other living beings are asking this question. What's the moral value of life? What's my role? How do I fit in? What am I supposed to do while I'm here? What's the in-between stuff for me? So we're asking that question. We're the ones created and designed to experience some sense of value, and purpose, and meaning to our lives. Human beings are that way. My dog is not struggling with this question, trust me. He's just going outside again, barking around the tree, kicking up mud, because he thinks that there's an animal up at the top of the tree who's living there and having babies or something. I don't know. So I set a trap last night with the cat food, one of those $38 traps that you buy at the Live Trap, by the way. I'm going to be humane in the way I do it, but I'm going to trap this thing, whatever it is, with my really stinky, smelly sardine fish in a little bowl right in the back. So the animal walks in, pushes down on the pan, and the back drops on it. So hopefully it's going to happen. I'll report to all of you when it happens, and I'll show you a picture. Huh?
What are you going to do with it? Yeah, what's going to happen once you trap this animal?
I'm not going to eat the animal. Don't. Oh. Yeah. There's a way to do that. There's a way to do that humanely. And I'll fill you in on how it happens. I'm not just going to drop it in a river somewhere with a burlap bag tied around its neck or something. Yeah, sandbag. So humanity has a moral obligation to live life in a certain way. That's what we all share, humanity. So everybody who, regardless of country of origin, color of skin, shares the same obligation to live life in a particular kind of way. And this is kind of the foundation that we see that's set for the book of Ecclesiastes. So the book of Ecclesiastes is actually very interesting with regards to its apologetical potential. Apologetical. In other words, trying to answer the real questions that people out there on the street are asking. And it's interesting that these are the questions that have been being asked for a long time, ever since human beings have been on the planet. I'm sure sitting around the campfire, people are going to pop the question, well, what's given you meaning to life lately? Things like that. So to be truly human is to understand the basic role, and this has to do with what we talked about in OT1, bearing the name or bearing the image of God. He stamped his image on us. He's wired us in a certain way so that we're the ones asking this question. And when we don't have the right answer, we struggle. And the struggle is intentional. We'll get into that here in a little bit as a means of getting our attention. All right. And it's interesting as we think about our ministries, we have a variety of ministries that we're preparing for. And it's not just the counseling ministries that some of you are involved in, but if you think we're all involved in counseling ministry, but really the overall term that I like to think of is the ministry of the reconciliation ministry, how we're helping people become reconnected to the very purpose for which they've been created and designed for. Does that make sense? So that at the foundation is obviously the reconnecting of one with their creator, God, in a right relationship, and in such a way that allows them to recharge, and not recharge, but to become fully functional again. So part of the discovery when you become a Christian then is, oh, I'm here for a reason. I have a job description, and it thrills me when I do that. It brings me purpose and fulfillment in new, refreshing ways that I've never experienced before. I don't know if you had a late in life conversion experience when I was, I don't know if have I shared my full testimony, just a little bit, bits and pieces in this class? Really? Well, I'll be short and brief, but as a senior in college, when I had been dating someone, the wrong person, for a couple of years, she broke up with me, which I thought would never happen, but it did. My life came crashing down. My car started to get rust spots, and I had all sights set on working for one of the world's largest corporations as a mechanical engineer, General Motors. And some things that happened at my last work study program, the very last semester, that had really left a bad taste in my mouth about high corporations. And I thought, I can't go that way. So I was devastated. I went back my senior year, and I thought, I'm just a mess. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. Why am I here? I was asking that question. I was asking that question as a senior in college. And I went to a church where I'd gone to my freshman year because my Christian roommate invited me once to church. And I remember I said, I'll just go back to that church. I remember that pastor was kind of intellectual. He seemed to connect well with the smart thinking people. I consider myself a smart thinking person at the time. And I went back to that church and started going. And then something got my attention. I have not talked to you about this before. I haven't shared that. Okay. She was sitting in the third row of the soprano section. Yeah. And I thought, okay, that choir, my way to meet that girl is to join this church choir. That was my motivation. So I went up to the choir director after one service. And I said, can I try out for your choir? And he said, we don't have tryouts. Just show up on a Thursday night for practice. So I did. And I joined this choir. And like I mentioned earlier tonight, it wasn't long before this group of people started really showing me a different way of living life I'd never seen before, how they treated each other, husbands and wives, and it's like they love each other, and they like to flirt with each other. I was like, what's going on here? They really love each other. It's like, I was like, this is weird, and I'm not used to this, and it got my attention. And then they invited me over to their homes and barbecues in the backyard, and they loved on me. And I was like, wow, this is authentic. This is real. What's going on here? And that's when the choir director said, let's have breakfast. Let's meet over in the student center on campus. And we started meeting. And probably the third time in, he asked me this question. Have you ever asked Jesus Christ to become the Lord of your life and to forgive you of your sins? To Tom, nobody's ever asked me that question before. You're the first one that's ever asked me that. So I, as an engineer, a thinking person, educated, senior in college, went home that day and sat in my green Lazy Boy recliner, blew off statics and dynamics, and sat there and thought about that question all day. And then I accepted Christ on my own, prayed, called him like he told me to. He said, come over for dinner. We're going to have a party. And so I went over, and that's when it started for me as a senior in college. So it all starts with, oftentimes, these are the questions that people ask, and we're the ones to come along. And as part of our ministry of reconciliation, all we have to do is ask them the question, hi, have you been struggling with meaning and fulfillment in your life lately? Start with that question and see where that goes. That's an interesting, neutral but loaded question, because everybody has a response to that. Well, but let me tell you what's been happening lately with me, And then you can say, well, I'm not a perfect person here, but I've got some things that I'd like to share with you that I think answer that question in the fullest way that I know how. I think you can transition into sharing your own testimony and then the gospel. So that's the apologetical value of this question. But ministries of reconciliation, all the different kinds of ministries that we have in the church are ministries that help people reconnect with their being part of humanity, purpose statement. I'm trying to think of, we help people become human again and start to rebuild their lives in the right direction. That's what we do when we introduce them to Christ, is we're reconnecting them to the very purpose for which they were created and designed for. And then they start to experience life in its fullest, and then they're not bouncing off the walls anymore with regards to meaning in life. They're not trying all of these philosophies and these hedonistic, excesses and living for the fullest and the experimentation, going up to the top of a mountain peak, taking that trip to Tibet, and all of these things that people do to try to find meaning and purpose in life. They're tapped into the source. So that's what we do in our ministries of reconciliation. The author of Ecclesiastes, the word in chapter 1, the word preacher is the Hebrew word koheleth, which means to gather, or kind of the gathering. The one who gathers together is the idea behind the idea of preacher, the one who gathers people together. He identifies him as a son of David, king of Jerusalem. Critical scholars will say, well, that's coming from some other hand, but I like to stay close to Solomon with regards to the authorship question here, because I think this whole book builds on the life experience of King Solomon. We're going to see here that this book screams and rails against all of the false ways that people try to get at personal meaning to life. And of any of the kings that we've read about, we know that King Solomon struggled with some of these things in his own personal life experience. He failed at some of these things, even though he had the gift of wisdom. But so I think as I read Ecclesiastes, I'm reading it as a first-hand account, but with a whole heart, leaving behind this deposit of wisdom. Don't do this. Don't make the same mistakes I did. So he's writing back from maybe being an older man, looking back on his own life and packaging together some of these mistakes and failures and pitfalls that he kind of ran into through his own experience of ups and downs as we said earlier, the half-hearted king. Now, like the book of Judges, the interpretive, or you might think the thesis statement of the book is found at the end. So let's start there and turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And let's see, I want to have, Patrick here in the middle. Could you read for us in chapter 12, starting in verse 9 down through verse 14?
Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and the light nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh.
I know, we know it. Okay, go ahead.
The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, with every secret thing, whether good or evil.
So he sees the same thing that we saw in the book of Proverbs, this proper orientation of one's life being described here again as the fear of the Lord, but it's also in the covenant context. So one who fears the Lord and walks in obedience to the commandments of the Lord. So all of these things work together, and it's no different than what Moses taught. I always go back to Moses. Let's turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 4 and see a connection there in verse 10 through 14. Deuteronomy 4, beginning in verse 10. Moses says, "Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai, when the Lord said to me, 'Assemble the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, that they may teach to their children. You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire to the very heart of the heavens, darkness, cloud, and thick gloom. Then the Lord spoke to you from the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but you saw no form, only a voice. So he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded to you to perform. That is, the 10 Devarim, the 10 commandments or words. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone, one copy for him, one copy for the people." So here again, the idea and the connection of fearing the Lord with walking in obedience. And it's the picture of the heart with feet. Have you ever noticed your fullness of life meter is at its fullest when you're walking in obedience. You know that. That's wisdom, practical knowledge that, you practice that and I know I'm having a bad day today. Let's see, what am I doing that I need to confess before the Lord, or unconfessed sin? Or what are those things why are my pipes getting clogged, kind of thing? You got a clean house, get right with the Lord and walk in obedience, and you find that the blessings and the happiness meter gets a little higher. So, and it's true, we feel the most complete as human beings when we give God the rightful and the right place within our lives. We honor him as king. We express a wholehearted willingness to walk in the path of obedience in any direction that the king sees fit. And here's a little video clip that I have that you probably know what these little things are. They've been around forever. I had one as a kid growing up, and I was entertained for hours with all of the stuff that you could do with these things. But if there was something that I could show you that pictures this fear of the Lord as an orientation of one's life, it's like if your life was a gyroscope. So that's my little picture here. We'll see what happens here.
This is a gyroscope. It consists of a metal wheel mounted on an axle. The wheel and axle is freely secured in a metal frame.
It's not plugged in to the TV for some reason.
Can behave in the most unexpected ways.
Sorry about that.
The components of this simple mechanism are obvious, and it doesn't seem to have any special capabilities.
We'll just
Stand it on end and falls over. Kind of suspended like this, and it drops. Apparently, it can't defy gravity. Spin the wheel, and all that changes. The strength provides a simple method to spin the wheel. First thing I notice about the spinning gyroscope is that it resists attempts to change its position.
resist attempts to change its position.
Rotate the gyro. Now when I stand it on the tabletop, it stays vertical. The spinning wheel is creating a force that holds the gyroscope upright. When the wheel stops, the force disappears and the gyroscope falls. Incredibly, this force will support the gyroscope like this. It appears to be levitating.
That's cool. So it's the orientation of one's life. They use gyroscopes on boats to navigate the open ocean so that they can keep the boat oriented in the right way, because the gyroscope that's spinning, is your reference to, resists motion. It resists the turning back and forth, sideways, and all of that. So it's an important little tool that's helpful for navigating, and it's a good picture of what it means to be rightly oriented to the Lord with regards to one's life. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in Proverbs. And we see here in Ecclesiastes, the fear of the Lord also in a covenant context is the foundation for the big question that's being asked by this book, Ecclesiastes. What's the moral value to one's life? How do you find the moral value to one's life? So the picture that comes from Ecclesiastes, here's our deep thought picture, and this clues us in to how the author starts his book in verse 2. The idea of vanity of vanities. The idea there is also the futility of futilities, or in the Hebrew idea, it's literally breath of breaths. So if you blow into your hand, you feel it, and then it's gone. That's the idea behind vanity of vanities, the futility of futilities. And let's just take a look at chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. And when I read, it's just interesting to have this picture of King Solomon as an older man looking back on his life. He writes, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher, "vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What advantage does man have in all the work which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also, the sun rises, the sun sets, and hastens to its place. It rises there again, blowing towards the south and turning towards the north. The wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses, the wind returns. Although all the river flows into the sea, yet the sea's not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. All things are wearisome. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. So there's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one might say, see this, it's new? Already it's existed for ages which were before us. There is no remembrance of earlier things and also of later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. So it's interesting. He's really, this is a book that gets under your skin a little bit if you look at it and study it, and it wrestles you to the ground, as we'll see. And in these first 11 verses, already that we're seeing here is this idea of futility. The futility of a man's existence outside of the answer to that question. Without the answer to the question, what is the moral value of life? The answer is vanity of vanities, futility of futilities. This sense of frustration that everything around me has its design, the rising and setting of the sun, the pathway of the water that finds its way into the ocean. Everything seems to know what it's supposed to do except for me. And this is causing me great frustration as I look around and contemplate myself in this world. I seem to be the only one that doesn't know what I'm supposed to do. That kind of feeling is what we have here. So what's my problem? This is what the author starts to ask. Why is it that I'm not experiencing happiness and fulfillment? So if we start to think about this being Solomon, here's a picture of Solomon. No, it's Einstein. He's the one with wisdom. We have a shocking declaration, and here we come in verse 12. Let's see, Austin, why don't you read it here with a little emphasis. 12 through 18. Pretend like you're Solomon.
Okay. I, the preacher, have been king.
No, not in a low voice. Like with a little, be yourself. Be yourself. Just be yourself. I feel like I'm an acting coach. Whoa.
I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all things, or all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this also is striving after wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain.
Whoa, what a if that's Solomon giving kind of a first-hand testimonial, the very gift that was given to him by God, wisdom, in and of itself became a source of frustration and futility. That's kind of interesting. We see, if we remind ourselves, if we turn back to 1 Kings, some of the assessments that were given by the author about Solomon, I think we see some similarities. Let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 10. 1 Kings chapter 10, beginning in verse 23. And here we saw from the author, so King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. Verse 24, and all the earth was seeking the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. And they brought every man his gift, articles of silver, gold, garments, weapons, spices, horses, mules, and so much year by year. Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, so many chariots and so many horsemen. He stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And the king made silver as common as stones in Jerusalem, and all blah, blah, blah. Remember that? All that assessment. How was Solomon applying his wisdom? Well, he was amassing gold. He was amassing an army. He was using it for political diplomacy and amassing women with covenant deals that were being made in the exchange of women and all of that. And we saw that King Solomon was using his gift of wisdom for himself, at least for part of his heart. I mean, well, part of it was being rightly applied, certainly for the construction of the temple and how he was applying wisdom and all of that. That was a high point, but then we have these other assessments. So there was this half-heart thing going on with King Solomon that we saw earlier with regards to this. What's interesting in this first chapter of Ecclesiastes, do you see in verse 13, and I set my mind, verse 13, you see it again in verse 16, and in my mind has observed. And then in verse 17, and I set my mind to know wisdom. You know what the Hebrew word there that's translated mind is actually the Hebrew word for heart. It's interesting. I think it should be left translated heart. Because remember, we talked about King Solomon, right? Having a heart like this, and the question was, which part of his heart is he applying? So with wisdom, Solomon is probably recollecting and looking back and reflecting on the fact that he applied this part of his heart to wisdom when he was experiencing this experience of futility. So that's, I think, what's going on here. I set my heart to seek and explore wisdom, is what he's saying here. We know from Moses, again, if we turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, let's just remind ourselves of what should the heart be applied to. And Moses talked about this in one of the famous passages in all of the Old Testament, the Shema passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, right? With all of your soul, with all of your might. And these words which I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart. So this is how we should be applying our heart. So that's what the heart should be engaged in, loving the Lord your God. So this pursuit of wisdom, I think Solomon here is probably admitting that some of his heart was not being applied in the right way with regards to his wisdom. Maybe he looked more like this guy, and we see a misapplication of Solomon's wisdom. In chapter 2, let's turn there. And another way that he pursued or applied his heart, there in verse 3. So I explored with my heart, or mind, you could say, how to stimulate my body with wine while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven for the few years of their lives. So now there's this futility idea. He starts to give lists of the things that he pursues as he's applying his heart. In verses 4 through 10, let's have Wes. Could you read for us? Chapter 2, beginning in verse 4 down through verse 10.
I increased my achievements. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself and planted every kind of fruit tree in them. I constructed reservoirs for myself from which to irrigate a grove of flourishing trees. I acquired male and female servants and had slaves who were born in my house. I also owned livestock, large herds and flocks, more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. I also amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I gathered male and female singers for myself and many concubines, the delights of men. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also remained with me. All that my eyes desired, I did not deny them. I did not refuse myself any pleasure, for I took pleasure in all my struggles. This was my reward for all my struggles.
It sounds like Solomon. Remember the evaluation that we had from Solomon, from the author of Kings, is lining up pretty well with that kind of evaluation. This is a self-evaluation, I would call, kind of coming from the king, looking back on his own life. And then we have the honest admission here with regards to verses 16 and 17 in chapter 2. He says, "For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind." It gets a little, you get to places like that, it's like, wow, this is really kind of a dark book. And it's a strategy that I think Solomon is applying here. He's building up a house, but he's tearing it down, right? Or he's tearing down the houses that he sees built around him in the kingdom. Because if this is the kind of house that you're building for your life, Solomon's wanting to tear it down before he gets to the solution at the end. So the solution he saves for the end. That's the fear of the Lord. That's the beginning of wisdom, and the beginning of finding the answer to life's most important question. Do you know people like this? They've got everything, but they're miserable, you know? If they're honest and open with you. Having all of the stuff, or having the accumulation of things, or the accumulation of reputation or status in society doesn't necessarily connect to the satisfaction in life that you're looking for, right? We know that, don't we? You know? And we know people like that, and there's going to be people like that in our ministries. Maybe even now, currently, you have people in your congregations who are deep down struggling with this kind of wrestling, and you need to introduce them to the book of Ecclesiastes for this reason. They need to understand, and they're not the first person to come along and struggle with trying to figure it all out with regards to what's going to bring me true satisfaction. It doesn't mean you have to be poor. I've met poor people too who struggle with the same dissatisfaction in life as well, for the same reasons. So, all right. Now, I'm just going to skip over this. This is a video. It's kind of a creative thing that some college students did way back in the day, where they wrote a spoken word rap on the entire book of Ecclesiastes. So I'll give that to you. It's in the PowerPoint slides. You can see that it's really well done. You probably remember Van Komatsu is the one who wrote it. Some of our former college students. But it's a whole spoken word written on the words of the preacher. You can watch that on your own, just for fun. So I can't play it because it's just coming through here. So he does a good job. He takes the words of this poem that was written by Van Komatsu. He did an extra credit project and wrote this whole thing that focuses on the whole book of Ecclesiastes. So read those words and you'll get the whole gist of the whole book of Ecclesiastes as it relates to King Solomon, who is the king who I think is writing this and leaving it to us. So it's really well done. And but he's not the only one around who's delved into this big theme, the big theme of the book. This poem is a modern example from a group of poets called Pink Floyd. This is the famous song Time, ticking away the moments that make up a dull day, fritter and waste the hours in an offhand way, kicking around on a piece of ground in your hometown, waiting for someone or something to show you the way, tired of lying in the sunshine, staying home to watch the rain. You are young and life is long and there is time to kill today, and then one day you find 10 years have gotten behind you. No one told you when to run. You missed the starting gun. You know, it's interesting how the theme of time kind of gets woven in to these, these ancient story, the ancient poetry that is coming here from King Solomon. Time keeps ticking, and you're in the midst and caught in between the rising and setting of sun. So time becomes a major theme in the book of Ecclesiastes, the reflection on things that show you that time is passing, the water that moves and finds its way into the ocean, the cycles that we see on the rising and setting of things, the stars that come out and then they disappear, the sun comes and then it sets. Home again. I like to be here when I can. When I come home cold and tired, it's good to warm my bones besides the fire. Far away across the field, the tolling of the iron bell calls the faithful to their knees to hear the softly spoken magic spell. That's kind of critical, I guess, of people that go to church. But anyway, it's the struggle of humanity. And a lot of songwriters, modern songwriters, songs that are out there in our world, struggle with this, with their poetry that they write. In Ecclesiastes, we see this struggle with time. We saw it in the early chapters there in chapter 1, verse 5. But chapter 3, there's this fuller description of the, and you're probably familiar with some of this language in chapter 3. He says in verse 1, there's an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. So here's the appropriateness of time, right? A time to give birth, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal. Well, hopefully in the right context. A time to tear down, a time to build up, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance. You get the idea. The appropriateness of things dropping into time except for my life. Where am I at in this cycle? See, this is what the author struggles with. And we see these are the normal activities of life that are common. It's part of the common experience of all humanity, and that's what we have. But then notice how it concludes in chapter 3, verse 11. He, God, has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, that is the heart of humanity, hardwired, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. So even there, you see the author here recognizing that this moral value to life is found in, again, the fear of God. Rightly oriented one's life to the reality of God as creator and as king. And that's kind of the thing that we see here going on with the author. So this is what the author's struggling with. Chapter 3, beginning in verse 12, he sees that everything is bound up in time. I know that there's nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It's a gift of God. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There's nothing to add to it, and there's nothing to take from it, for God has so worked that men should fear him. Now, we have to be careful that we're not drawing, the answer too early to the question. It's not that he's saying, well, just go out and do whatever you want, or just eat, drink, and be merry. I mean, there's nothing more. I mean, no. The answer's found at the end, so we have to balance passages like this with what we know that we're eventually going to get to at the end. But the author is making sure that we know that there's more to life than just the eating, drinking, and being merry part of it. Those things are a gift from God. Perhaps they bring temporary enjoyment, but then there's something deeper than that that we're ultimately going after, not just those things. So let's just keep going here. I like the quote by Blaise Pascal with regards to what we see in this eternity principle from verse 11, the fact that God's woven or hardwired into our humanity the sense of eternity. It seems to be coming out of verse 11 here. Blaise Pascal said, and he's a Christian philosopher, mathematician, there is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man which cannot be filled by any created thing, but only by God, the Creator, made known through Jesus. That's the full quote from Blaise Pascal. And I think that's what we see here in chapter 3 in verse 14. I know that everything God does will remain forever. So on the scale of eternity, things that will last, there's moral value to life that's essentially weighed on the scales of eternity. So if we're rightly oriented to God, the fear of the Lord idea, that sets us up with right orientation so that things that we do matter and add value to that which is eternal. And that fulfills us. That's the design. That's why we are here on earth. And if man is not oriented properly, based on all those philosophies and other ways of answering the question that we talked about earlier, other systems and ways of doing things, then the result is this empty experience that he starts the book out with regards to futility of futilities. Now, let's see here. Let's just move on. I want to get to the end of Ecclesiastes. So Ecclesiastes chapter 6. Let's skip over a little bit here with regards to... Now, Ecclesiastes chapter 6, the whole chapter there is... really throws out this cry of despair, I think. Let's see. Mark, over here, could you read for us chapter 6, beginning in verse 1?
There is evil that I have seen under the sun, and that lies heavy on mankind. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires. Yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It is a grievous evil. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and he also has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For it comes in vanity and goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it has not seen the sun or known anything, yet it finds rest rather than he. Even though he should live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoy no good, do not all go to one place?
Yeah, keep going.
All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. For what advantage has the wise man over the fool? And what does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wondering of the appetite. This also is vanity and striving after wind. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, and that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity, and what is the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun?
That gets pretty real, doesn't it? Passages like that. And you see the verses 3 through 5, it seems the author is suggesting it's better to have never been born. You know, he's making this pretty extreme argument with regards to a life of vanity and futility versus just, I don't even wish I was never born, kind of total desperation. In verse 12, who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? So we see this chapter, you know, really speaks and sings, I guess, when you think of Solomon perhaps behind it in terms of the author. So we have, this poetic way of expressing this futility. These sad songs, this is what we have here, is a really sadly written song, this desperation. This is Harry Chapin's Cats in the Cradle. I was asking, what's one of the most depressing songs that's ever been written? You know that, Cats in the Cradle and the Silver Spoon, Little Boy in the Wind. And you know, it's just, how's it go at the end? I'll be with, it's kind of a sad song. I can't play it now because the TV's not. Yeah, something about, it's just a depressing song, you know, and this is what we have. Again, the author's strategy is to kind of tear down the house that you've built for yourself with regards to, you know, your meaning to life, what you've been after. And that's what we have going on in the book. He's tearing down houses that have been built by perhaps society around him, and houses of false meaning that are around in the kingdom, and many houses that even the king himself built for himself. He's tearing them down as well. So let's see. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 7, down in verse 13 through 14. This is an interesting question that we have that Solomon, I think, is asking. He says, "Consider the work of God, for who is able to straighten what he has bent? In the day of good or prosperity, be happy. But in the day of adversity or bad, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not discover anything that will be after him. what's interesting there is in verse 14 that we see. And this is, again, the play off of the Hebrew word good or tov, Hebrew word tov or good, and bad, sometimes translated evil. And what's interesting is that we have this experience, but in the day of adversity or bad, consider. Well, what should I consider, he asks. Well, he answers this question there in the last part of verse 14. God has made the one as well as the other. Uh-oh, that's interesting. God has made days of good or prosperity, as well as God being responsible for making and bringing about days of bad or adversity. I'm not going to use the word evil, because I'm not making God to be the author of evil. We don't do that. We know that's wrong. But one Hebrew word can be translated and is translated in various contexts. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that word is the same as the word translated here as bad or adversity. So it's interesting. And now let's talk about this and blow this up a little bit. It's the same question that Job asked. We're going to get to Job next week. Let's turn to the book of Job in chapter 2. And we know that the book of Job deals with a different question with regards to, we think of that the question, and I'll get into it next week, but what is the moral value of suffering? Why do the righteous suffer? Is really the question that Job asks. But Job asks the same question in chapter 2, verse 10. Do you see there, when he's speaking to his wife, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? And all this Job did not sin with his lips. So it's this bigger question that we have with regards to accepting only the good, but not the adversity, not the hardship, not the difficulties. If we're in this orientation, this fear of the Lord orientation before God. So those of us in counseling ministry, right, which is pretty much all of us if we're in ministry, here's the application. If we're involved in biblical counseling, the spiritual health of the one that we're trying to help needs to recognize the ability to navigate or push through these times of adversity. We need to help people recognize that it's a both and when we're rightly oriented before the Lord. So one who's oriented with the heart with feet has the ability to walk through and in some cases push through the times of good and the times of pushback, the times of adversity. And this is the challenging part of our ministries. How do we help people practically do that in their lives? Do we think that the best thing that we can help people do is recognize, well, you're something bad is happening to you because you've done something wrong, or in Job's case, you've offended the gods. God's punish the wicked and only reward the righteous. We'll get to that next week, but what we have to recognize here in this context, in the context of Ecclesiastes, here's what the author of Ecclesiastes is saying. Meaning to life can be experienced in both times of good and times of adversity. How's that? In fact, the depth of meaning to life possibly becomes more clear in times or in the midst of times of adversity. And if you've ever gone through times of adversity, sometimes it's the heat of life that can really clear things up really quick. Yeah.
So to tie this full circle with the adversity of the leaf spring breaking on your camper.
Yes.
But we see something like this, and how do we separate, not only personally, but through looking at other people, with something that would be true adversity? Now, God was sovereign, and this happened at that time, that he allowed that to happen.
Yeah.
But granted, leaf springs are made by man, and they're meant to fail and break.
Yeah. Well, okay.
And we expect that they last forever, but we don't act that way.
Yeah.
And then when it happens, we say, what did we do wrong? Or, this is hardship or adversity, when it's just a matter of...
Yeah. I mean, I put Yeah, adversity is a broad term that I use to describe a combination of things. Adversity can come from a world that's fallen, which is in the case of the broken leaf spring. Living in a fallen world can sometimes create pushback, right? Things break. Or adversity can come, at the hands of a bad boss. If you're in a job situation, for example, adversity can come because of interpersonal relationships. But really, all of it goes back to, here's what I think I'll answer your question. We want to go back to and remind ourselves again of what Moses has done for us from the very beginning. Not only did Moses define what does it mean to be truly human, but Moses defined for us what does it mean to be truly human but in a fallen world. If we go back to Genesis 3, and we look at verses 14 through 19, Moses gives us just a few examples of the kinds of things that came after the rebellion occurred from Adam and Eve. So as they represent us, the rest of humanity, and their fall is our fall. And we see in chapter 3, beginning in verse 14, judgment comes against the guilty parties, the serpent, Adam, and Eve. All three receive very specific things that are coming their way as a result. So futility comes as judgment, divine judgment, in response to the rebellion that happens. So I think when we see this, and it's because we ate the wrong tree. We ate from the tree of the knowledge of good, and I'll keep the word translated this way: the knowledge of the tree of good and adversity, good and bad. So I'm playing off that Hebrew word ra, which can be translated evil, bad, or adversity. So I ate from that tree because Adam ate from that tree. So that's my tree. And now it's my job as a human being is to reconnect to the very purpose for which I was designed and created to do. But in the midst of adversity, I still have to do that. That's still my job, is to live out and best I can fully express my humanity in a God kind of way, according to God's plan for my life and what God has designed for me. So how do I get reconnected to that? In a sense, rebuild my life, and in the process help others to rebuild their lives in such a way that they can fully express their humanity in the right way. In the midst of the adversity. So I think that's the question that these authors are getting at. It's not only when times are good, but it's also when times can be rough. But in both contexts, we're still called to the same purpose, and that's, living in the fear of the Lord, in obedience, and deriving meaning and value, moral value to our lives, even in the midst of adversity. We can do that. That's the difference, that's the unique thing about Christians, those who are walking with the Lord, is that we're the ones that can stand in the midst of adversity and still experience that meaning to life, even in the midst of adversity. I mean, the Richard Dawkins test, if you think about how's he going to apply his his philosophy of life when he's in the midst of adversity. I call it the Richard Dawkins test. What would he think of this scenario,
So you can say it's a refocus on the idea that's not about us. Like, for example, you break your leaf spring and you're redirected into the fact that God's purpose was in this, and maybe you have the opportunity to have shared with the rec service guy.
Which I did.
Right.
I encouraged him.
It's a good that was worked through what you saw as something that was bad. But if we as Christians think of that adversity against us, we missed opportunities, seeing that God is first and others second kind of idea.
Yeah, and I was able to model to my watching daughter how someone who's walking with the Lord responds to adversity. I was able to allow her to see Dad in a stressful situation with semis blaring down the road at 85 miles an hour. And I could do nothing about it, but I was there to protect my family, and I was making decisions to care for and provide for my two princesses, my queen and my princess, that were in the car along the way. So she commented on that later, and she said, "Dad, I'm glad that you didn't lose your tempers that really bad. I was able to keep cool hand, and we say, okay, let's pray. I mean, I needed to find a solution. I mean, Ellen was out there and Hannah was in the car. She had her, she was plugged into her electrical devices, but she was watching. And, she saw, husband and wife working out a conflict, working together as a team, for example, and all those valuable life lessons that you want your kids to see. You let your kids see you in a situation of adversity, living out your, that's what we want to do as parents, just to let them see us, warts and all. But what does it look like to work through conflict? I mean, if she's in the same scenario, 5 years from now, what will she do? Hopefully similar things to what she saw us do, it's kind of so. But it's interesting that we, in the midst of this adversity situation, remember and I've gone here before, if we turn to the New Testament in the book of Romans, sometimes we're too quick to quote the Romans 8:28 verse to someone who's struggling in the midst of adversity without giving them the full picture of what Romans 8 is really talking about. I think the thing that I'm kind of railing against here a little bit is that some people out there watching think that when you become a Christian, everything's going to go perfect for you in your life. It's kind of this false promise. And when people come to know the Lord and things even get worse, they kind of run for the hills kind of thing. Romans 8:28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. But in the earlier chapters, Paul's talking about suffering with Christ, right? You remember that? And as part of being part of the family of God, or here in the earlier verses, being led by the Spirit of God and being called sons of God, verse 14, if children also heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer, verse 17, with him, Christ, in order that we may be glorified with him. So what Paul does amazingly is put the good and attaches the good to our suffering. Why? It's because it seems to be connected to something that's eternal. When we suffer and endure and respond in the right way through adversity, the good that comes out of that is this eternal glory that's going to be following us into eternity, something that we're going to be able to give to God, or God's already in some sense receiving now. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. So it's that future glory that somehow gets produced as we endure and push through adversity in the right way. That's what we need to be helping our people do in our churches, our Sunday school classes, and our congregations. People who are out there experiencing real firsthand adversity, help them to be oriented in such a way that they can produce glory and still derive satisfaction and meaning to their life through the adversity. That's when the real magic starts to happen. That's when we start to see this happen, what Paul's writing about in Romans 8. So when we know these storms are going to come, it's the gyroscope picture that I saw earlier, how the gyroscope works. It's the orientation of one's life. And when we have that gyroscope orientation to our life, it's going to resist that being moved around. It's going to always have that right orientation and be able to navigate through the storms of life when they come, and we know that they will. Well, let's finish up Ecclesiastes, and I'll get you out here early. Let's see. I might want to pass over this. This is one of those a little difficult to get around, but Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 15, I'll lightly cover it. I always throw it out as a kind of an interpretation challenge, but let's look at it briefly. Chapter 7, verse 15. If you read it over, in other words, my point is if you just kind of read it over lightly thinking about it, you may kind of come to a shocking conclusion. He says, I have seen everything during my lifetime of futility. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness. So he's looking out in the world and observing and saying, I see righteous people die way too soon, but I look at this wicked man over here, and he's living to be 105 years old. Why is his life prolonged? And he's lived a whole life of being wicked. There seems to be an imbalance in this whole thing, according to the author. He asks in verse 16, so he concludes, do not be excessively righteous and do not be overly wise. What? Doesn't that conflict or contradict what we've heard about, from Moses the whole way? Why should you ruin yourself? Do not be excessively wicked and do not be a fool. Why should you die before your time? He's kind of bouncing off this question here, isn't he? It is good that you grasp one thing and also let go of the other, for if one who fears God comes forth with both of them. And then down through verse 20, wisdom strengthens a wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Indeed, there is not a righteous man on earth who continually does good and who never sins. So all the way down through verse 30, and so the whole context of verses 15 all the way down through verse 20, we've got this righteous versus wicked kind of contrast being played out. So the author here is observing what seems to be an apparent imbalance. Sometimes the wicked one lives longer in terms of life and longevity than the one who's righteous. So why be righteous and live a short life when you can be wicked and live a long life, right? It's kind of a little shocking game that he's playing with his readership. And I think it's intentional. It's kind of intended to get our attention and kind of whack us over the head a little bit. Because then he concludes, and he says down here at the bottom, a little bit of this. Here's kind of the logic that he uses with his questions. Don't be excessively righteous. Don't be overly wise. Why ruin it for yourself? Don't be excessively wicked. Don't be overly foolish. Why should you die before your time? So the balance that he gives here at the end is in this slide that I think, and he brings in again, interestingly, the fear of the Lord. So I think if we take verse 20 with the acknowledgement that there is not a righteous man on earth who continually does good and who never sins, what he's doing is talking about it this way. The fear of the Lord is really where we need to land. So verse 18, in his reference to the one who fears God comes forth with both of them. You have to navigate through life, and here's what he's getting at, I think. So one who fears the Lord is going to be able to navigate through the reality where both good and bad or evil exists, and to navigate through with that proper balance and orientation to the Lord. So the fear of the Lord is what brings necessarily balance to the potential imbalance, right, that comes with the lifestyle of wickedness or the lifestyle of righteousness. The fear of the Lord is what we have available to us that helps us to navigate through the potential for these two extremes. So I think that's the way that we go with that.
It's funny because you think Christ's righteousness, he died for it, And it seems like, maybe Peter in his proclamation is like, why would you die? Thinking he's a righteous man, righteous rabbi. Why put yourself to ruin by being, righteous? It seems like overly righteous.
Yeah.
And dying before your time.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the fear of verse 18, though, I think is where the balance comes in with the fear of the Lord. So, well, let's see. Let's turn to the very end here. We're getting close to the end. Chapter 9, verse 10 and 11, I want to focus on a little bit. Sounds a little bit like a Bob Dylan song. Whatever your hand finds to do, verily, do it with all your might, for there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you are going. I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, and the battle is not to the warriors, and neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to the men of ability, for time and chance overtake them all. Desperation, doesn't it? Sounds kind of depressing, but again, it's kind of like a well-written song. Kind of has a way of deflating or knocking down your straw houses. This is probably the place where you can see the author here getting really close to that existential kind of idea with regards to if all I really have is my life, and even that's not forever, then I should live as if that is all that matters. So that existential kind of I'm the center of my meaning kind of solution. But again, he's trying to draw out these false sense of these perspectives or philosophies of life that are false. I think he's trying to do that and leading us, tearing those things down before he builds them back up there at the very end. Let's move to the very end here, this depressant, this haunting picture. Finally, the conclusion here in chapter 12, which again, after a whole 11 chapters of raising the problem and describing with all of his poetic, expertise, and we have all the different routes of futility and all of its various forms. He finally gets to the strong argument from the king in terms of what the solution is. And we read it earlier, starting in verse 9. So he concludes, in addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge. And he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. So this is what the king has done over his lifetime. The preacher sought to find delightful words and to write words of truth correctly. The words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. Well-driven nails, I like that. They are given by one shepherd. But beyond this, my son, be warned, the writing of many books is endless, so don't overdo it. The excessive devotion to books is wearing to the body. But the conclusion is this: when all has been heard, and we've said it before, and we saw it earlier, is fear God, keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. Everybody who's part of the human race needs to be connected to this thesis statement. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or bad or evil. So this is true for all humanity, all image of God bearers. The single responsibility here is to fear God and obey his commandments. And this is true for times of good or times of adversity, kind of like what we hear in our wedding vows. Through good times and bad, richer or poor, and all of that. This is what we hear coming through. So the pushback from the world has a way to reduce all human effort to come up with meaning to life into futility or an experience of futility, unless it's rightly oriented in this way. That is the fear of the Lord. So that's his big thesis statement. All right. Well, let's end a little bit early, and I'll see you next week with our discussion of the most controversial book of the Old Testament, Song of Solomon.